What's up, YouTube? Today I'm going to be talking about this Inwin 301. I did a video on it somewhat recently, and I've gotten a few questions about GPU clearance, so I'm going to be going over that today. So let's open it up, press in, set this aside. So last time I was using a reference RX 488 gig, and I've since upgraded to a 5700 XT. Well, when I was looking for a GPU, I was concerned about clearance because there's not a lot of space underneath this, and I'll go over that in a minute. But the thing about 5700 XTs is that a lot of them are pretty big. Like my brother, he's got the Red Devil variant, which is far too big to fit in this case. And I opted for the Red Dragon because it's pretty close to the same size as the RX 480 reference. It's essentially the same length and the same thickness or height, and the width of it is, this is a little bit wider, but it's well within the limits of this case. And so to give you an idea of how wide a card you could fit in this case, so from the start of the card over there all the way out to, say, about here, which is where the glass meets up more or less. Let me get that measurement for you. It's about 6 inches or 15 centimeters. You couldn't run all the way to that, of course, because you still have your power cables that need to plug in there. So you're gonna have to go a little bit less than that, but maybe 5 inches, which is about 127 millimeters or so, which is pretty good size. And from the front fans all the way to the rear of the case is about 31 and a half or so centimeters, 315 millimeters or so. And they Inwin has these specs, these internal specs, or the size of a GPU that you could fit in it, and they claim 300 millimeters, which I would say is true. And if you didn't have front case fans, you could go even a little bit further, since the thickness of a case fan, the center thickness is about an inch or 25 millimeters. So you could go all the way up to 325, or even maybe a little bit more, 335. So you can definitely go with a pretty long card in here. The biggest concern for me was definitely the height or the thickness of it. So let me move the camera and I'll give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. All right, so now that you can see the inside of the computer, I've taken the video card out, and you can see, because this is a B450 that doesn't come with wireless, I've got a wireless card in the lowest PCIe slot. Actually, I'm not even sure that is the lowest. I imagine it is, yeah. Looks like it's the lowest. And that gives me enough clearance to fit one of these video cards in. But if I wanted to fit something thicker or taller in there, then that card would definitely be in the way, in which case I would recommend opting for a B550 motherboard that comes with wireless already. There, some of the newer ones come with Wi-Fi 6 as well, which is what this wireless card is, which is a big step up from 5th generation Wi-Fi. And I want to say that I was looking at a B550 board somewhat recently when I was thinking about upgrading my GPU, and saw that many of the more mid-range cards wouldn't fit in here. Of course, I was hoping to get a new graphics card like anybody else, and like all of you out there, we're all well aware of the shortage of GPUs. So I decided, instead of waiting for those cards to become available, which could be, who knows, sometime mid this year, late this year, I figured it was time for me to upgrade anyway. And worst case scenario, you know, I could sell this card and then I'd take a little bit of a hit in terms of money, maybe lose $100 or $150 or something like that. But I got it for $360 on Newegg, so I was very happy about that. And so when I was looking for a card and I realized that so many of the different cards would not fit in here, because of this wireless card and that thickness clearance, that height clearance. I was looking at motherboards and I saw a B550 that was like $120 some or something like that, and it came with Wi-Fi 6 already in it, so I wouldn't have had to use my lowest slot. The other thing to consider is where this PCIe slot is. So as you can see, mine runs all the way up to about the low end, the bottom end of my memory slots, and that runs just about all the way up to the top of the motherboard. There's not a very big distance from the top of the RAM ports up to the top of the motherboard. So that's about as high as you're gonna get for a PCIe slot. And so this is sort of best case scenario minus the wireless card. So I'll go ahead and measure this distance from the bottom of the PCIe slot down to the PCB of the wireless card, because that is the lowest slot. So in the event that you're going to be using a wireless card, you're going to have a very similar scenario, very similar issue. It's about 1.5 inches. Which is about 38 millimeters. So 38 millimeters or 1.5 inches from the top of this PCB up to the bottom, the absolute bottom of the opening for the top PCIe slot. Okay. So if you were to get a B550 motherboard, you'd get more clearance, obviously, because you wouldn't have this wireless card. And so I'm going to measure from the fan, the top of my bottom case fans, up to that same slot. And I know it's hard for you guys to see this in video, but I've got a pretty good view. Two and 5/16, or about 53 millimeters. Let me just double check that. Two and 5/16, which is not 53, it is about 57, 58 millimeters. I'd say it's 58 millimeters or 2 and 5/16, depending on how you like your units. And these are standard case fans, standard thickness, 25 millimeters. So if you were to remove the lower case fans, which I would not recommend in this case, then you could fit an extra 25 millimeters in there, which on top of the 58 would land you at, what is that? $60 or 83 rather, 83 millimeters. So that would give you a pretty good clearance for a pretty thick card. And just to give you an idea of how thick this card is, I don't know. Let me see if you can see that. So here is the Red Dragon. And it looks like it's only about 35 millimeters, but that doesn't include the thickness, of course, of the fan and the shroud. So if I get a slightly better view of it on my own. It's almost exactly 4 centimeters or 40 millimeters. And these fans, as they're pulling air in, might actually flex outward just a little bit, where when this is spinning and it's intaking air, it might pull itself out just a little bit and take up another millimeter or two. So I'd say about 42 millimeters. So you could get something substantially taller or thicker than this without having an issue, as long as you don't have this lower PCIe slot already taken up. A couple other things to consider about this case, okay, is the feet. This is one of the original feet, and this is, let me see the thickness on this. It's about 5/8 of an inch, which makes it about 16 millimeters. So I got some new rubber feet. Let me move the camera so you guys can see that. So there's the new rubber foot. I'll place this guy underneath here. And I'm sure you would see that compared to this 5/8 or so, this is about an 1 inch and an eighth, which is like 25 plus 3, so 28, maybe 29 because of the decimal point. 28, 29 millimeters in height. And another thing about it is, since this runs all the way from the left side to the right side of the case, it actually blocks air from coming in through the back side or through the front side, which these feet do not. And of course, I had the freedom of placing them as close to the edge, as either edge, as I wanted to. So that freedom allowed me to avoid blocking any of the fan inlet space. So this is the Red Dragon 5700 XT by Power Color, and this is the reference RX 480. So you can see the greatest difference in dimension is the width. And this fits in there pretty easily. Like I said, there's plenty of space in there for it. But the other thing about it is these are about basically the same thickness, and you can't see that from here, but they essentially are, and even in length, in terms of length, they are almost identical. The 480 is maybe 1 or 2 millimeters longer, but the biggest difference between these and how it relates to performance within this case is this is a shroud and fan assembly, and the RX 480 is a blower. So it doesn't have a fan shroud. It doesn't have any openings along the sides to let air out. None. Okay? So what happens is this blower fan, as many of you may know, just blows all the air out through the back of the PC, right near the I/O, and by the just below the rear case fan. And this blower fan will blow that air out, and more air will be fed in through here and potentially here. And the reason this makes a difference is Inwin's recommendation for the orientation of fans for this case is you should have the lower as intake, which I agree with essentially always, because it's always going to blow nice cool air into your GPU, whether it's shroud or it's blower. But the thing is, they recommended that the rear and front fans, the case fans, be exhausts, all of them. And the thing is, this one as an exhaust totally works all the time. That's a great idea. But the front fans as an exhaust, I would not necessarily agree with. And I'll tell you why. With this blower GPU, if you have 2 intake fans at the bottom, but then you have the rear case fan working as an exhaust, the power supply, which is at the top, also taking air in just above the CPU and blowing it out the back, and you also have a blower style GPU which is taking in air and blowing it out the back, then you've essentially got 3 exhausts. And then you add your front 2 exhausts, and now you have 4 exhausts essentially. It doesn't exactly work that linearly, but you've got a lot of exhausts and you've only got 2 intake fans. So what I did to test this, I ran it with the recommended orientation first, and I found that I got a baseline, and then I decided to turn the front two fans off. I just disconnected them because you just take off the side panel, and it was easy enough for me to just reach. The plugs were right there. So I unplugged them, and then I continued to run it, and I just kind of put a piece of paper up to the side vent on the far side over there, behind the opposite side of where the tempered glass is. And at that vent, I noticed it was actually not blowing air out. It was actually pulling air in. And so I decided to change them to intake. And when I did that, I did make like a 3-degree difference to the GPU. So it was just bringing a little more fresh air to help with the GPU. In terms of CPU, I didn't really see much of a difference. But that's my recommendation if you're going to use a blower GPU, which I know are not super common. The other thing is, if you're going to be using a fan shroud style, which is much more common, which I did a baseline with that as well, and then running the same orientation that I had already previously set up with the front fans as intake, and then once I got my baseline, I switched them to exhaust, and I actually got an improvement. And the reason for this is, this GPU, although it doesn't necessarily block the rear from exhausting, it kind of does, because this plastic shroud is sort of in the way of this grill here. But it doesn't actively blow it out the back like this card does. What this card does instead is it has openings all around the GPU, which allow the air to blow out as it blows in through the fan shroud, and then it blows out through any of these vents. And so it's really blowing the hot air into the case all the way around it, except for this, which blows out of the case. And so without that extra exhaust of a blower GPU, it actually needed an exhaust in the front. And the way that I tested it again was, of course, getting my baseline and then switching it and finding out. But I also just unplugged my fans and found out if it was blowing air out that side vent or if it was pulling air in, and it was blowing it out. So I ended up switching them. I got about a 3-degree difference or so. The biggest thing you're going to do with this case, thermally, I would say, is you're going to, and this is, I've got a Wraith Prism now, because I found it nearby for $20, and I thought that's a good deal. I should take it. But I had a Wraith Spire on my 3600X. I bought the 3600X because it came with the Spire instead of the Stealth that 3600 came with, which is it was a difference of $10. 3600 was $195, and the 3600X was $205 at the time. I know they're like, you can't even find them now, and even if you do, they're like closer to $250, maybe even more these days. But yeah, I bought it specifically to get the Wraith Spire, and I upgraded to the Prism, but I'll tell you, it's not worth the upgrade unless you're like really close to your peak thermals, peak thermal limit, and you, that 1 or 2 degree difference would make or break for you. In my case, it wasn't so. I was reaching about 62 degrees running Cinebench R20, and then I switched to the Wraith Prism, and I got like 60. So about a 2 degrees Celsius difference, so not much. But what I did after that was I increased my case fan into my all 3 of these actually, and then even the fronts. I increased those fan curves to run a little more aggressively in hopes that it would help my RX 480. And it did help a little bit, but not much, not a whole lot. And I would say that the case fans are quite a lot louder than the Wraith Prism or even the Wraith Spire. So I would say find a good volume, a good noise level for your case fans for that. And I would say I tried turning them way down just to see what I would get. And when I was running my GPU, and I was running it at just about the 5700 XT limit, at about 200 watts or so, maybe 210, just kind of peaking to 210, but closer to like between 190 and 200 watts. And I was getting a junction temperature that was exceeding 100 degrees Celsius, but this was with the case fans running very, very low, under 1,000 RPMs, and the GPU doing about 3,000 RPMs. Okay, so I ended up turning my fan curve up just a little bit, and I would say the case fans are maybe still not as loud as my CPU, which isn't super loud anyway. But I've gotten them a little bit closer to the CPU's noise level, and now my GPU runs about a between 87 and 90 degree junction temperature, while only doing about 1200 RPMs, which is a huge difference. And of course, this comes from the fact that this is pulling air straight from here. When it sits here, it's pulling air right from these intake fans. And so if these intake fans aren't doing a whole lot of work, it's kind of just pulling in the case air as opposed to pulling in this air. There's not a whole lot of contribution from these lower case fans to the GPU in that case, where if you turn these up just a little bit more, then it makes a big difference to how cool the air is coming into here. And as well as, of course, the more you turn up your exhaust fans, the more it's going to exhaust some of that hot air as well. So it made a big difference, and I would say that the three of them, when I'm running a pretty demanding game for the GPU, the noise level between the GPU and the case fans is pretty close. And then when I'm running something that's pretty CPU heavy, then the noise level between my CPU and my case fans are pretty close. And when I'm doing something that's kind of in between the three, if I'm running like 1440p high frame rate in a game that I could be doing 4K 60, then I'm doing a little more CPU load. Or if I have something else running in the background, CPU load, while I'm gaming, then they're all sort of at load. And I would say that the noise levels are all about the same. So the annoying thing was at first when I had the GPU a little bit too loud, and then the other time when I had the case fans way too loud, and now like finding a balance between them has really made the difference. And for reference, those are essentially my peak temperatures. I'm getting about 60 degrees with my 3600X, but I've changed my voltage to 1.8125 volts. Okay, and I'm running 4175 base clock, or boost clock rather, which I really don't see any need for more than that for anything that I do. Maybe I would turn it up to 4400, which is a standard boost, if I felt like I needed to, but I don't. And then in that case, I might be running as much as 1.2 volts, 1.25 volts, something like that. And the GPU, I'm running it at stock clocks, all the way up to 2083 or 2087 megahertz, something like that. And I'm running I want to say I'm not running 1.2 volts. I'm running 1150 millivolts or 1.15 volts, just about. And I'm I changed the power consumption up to the power allowance up by, I don't know, 12 or 13% or something like that, so that I could get all the way up to sustain those clocks of about 1900 to 2000 megahertz. Because otherwise it kind of ends up dropping clocks quite a bit when you leave it at the stock power limit. So this card happens to have two VBIOS. It has a silent and an OC, and the reason I chose silent over OC, the silent on this is no longer a 0 fan speed. It just has a lower minimum. So the OC, I think, has a minimum fan speed of something like 1300 RPM, while the silent has as low as like 900 or something like that, which is preferable for me. I like it to be almost dead silent when I'm doing just about nothing. So I set it to that, and then I just kind of played with my fan curves for for junction temperature between like 90 degrees to 100 degrees Celsius, just about, because that's really the only part that I'm concerned with. Maybe as much as like even as low as 85 I might be concerned with, but prior to that it doesn't really make a difference. I want it to run minimum fan speed if it can at that point, because it's not really working all that hard. But yeah, my CPU when I'm doing full load is about 60 degrees Celsius. My GPU is showing temperatures of 78 and then 90 for junction, just about. And it's pretty quiet and it runs pretty well, and I keep it in here a solid like 76, 78 degrees or so Fahrenheit, which is, what is that in Celsius? Let's see, 76 minus 32 times 5 divided by 9 or something like that. 25 degrees Celsius is what I'm looking at. in here. So yeah, not so bad. And I would say even on this RX 480, which is a blower and it's known to be kind of hot, it was running okay. It was within range, and this is well below what AMD specified as 110 degree junction temperature was within range. So I'm well below that. I'm a full 20 degrees below that with a pretty quiet fan curve. If I really needed to, if I lived in a hotter climate, if I didn't want to run my AC all the time in the summer or whatever, then I could do a little bit better than what it is already doing. So I would say thermally, I am thoroughly impressed by the performance of this case, and I'd recommend it to anybody who's considering getting it but just concerned about whether there's room. If there's not enough room, get a B550. Don't get a B450, so you don't have to take up that lower slot with a Wi-Fi card, and get a motherboard that has as high of a first slot as possible. And then you can pretty much go with any GPU that fits within the specs, and it's going to stay cool, I would say. And undervolt your Ryzen CPU if you don't already, because there's no point in running like 1.4 or 1.45 volts or something like that, unless you're doing some crazy overclocking. But I'm not. So even at 4400, I could probably run 1.2 volts or something like that, and it'd still be stable. I use Unreal Engine, I use Blender, I use SolidWorks, and I do video editing, obviously, at least a little bit, and no crashes at 1.8125 at 4175. So all in all, I recommend this case if you're looking to get it, and I hope that the questions you might have had about this case, especially after watching my first video or seeing somebody else's videos, I hope they've been cleared up by now. So anyway, that's all I have for you guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later.